Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this program related to our exhibition, Improving Nature, which is a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the invention of Masonite in Laurel, Mississippi. I have with me today one of the participating artists in the exhibition, Adrien Segal. Thanks so much for joining us, Adrien. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. Would you give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. I was born in California where I now live, but was raised in Colorado, kind of at the base of the Rocky Mountains. So a lot of the inspiration from my work definitely comes from natural places, and that was probably a big influence of growing up in such a beautiful natural environment. And came to California to go to art school when I was 18 and ended up just staying. So I've lived here for about 20 years now in Oakland, California. And I've got a workshop studio space I share with a bunch of other artists and fabricators in a large decommissioned naval building in Alameda, California. So, building they used to use for building planes during World War II, and now we use as a wood shop. A lot of people in there are making cabinetry and furniture, and I'm kind of one of the only people making more sculptural work. Being on an island right on the edge of the water in the bay for a studio space for the last 12 plus years has also really influenced my work. A lot of my work is really responsive to the environments and landscapes in which I spend a lot of time, and being next to the ocean and in the middle of a city, but also very much surrounded by a lot of um, diverse nature is really a big influence on my work.
Nature is a big influence. And are there any artists from the past or even contemporary artists who also are inspired by nature that might have inspired you as well?
There absolutely are. However, I don't usually look to other art to inspire my work. I look more out to like places and historical contexts, or just stories and information that feed my work in a different way than looking at an artist would. So there's definitely some really cool history of like wood carvers in Northern California, because we have such a supply of a local natural resource that many other places in the world don't have anymore because they cut down a lot of their trees, and we've done that too, but there's still some really great salvage supply places here for material. And so that's been a big influence. And then there's, over many years have been a lot of influential fabricators and artists in this area um, who just make really amazing work that is very much site specific in the material sources. So a good example would be someone like J.B. Blanc, who's was a wood carver up in Tomales Bay near Point Reyes Station, um, and uh, and even though San Francisco Bay Area isn't like a major hub of the contemporary art market like LA and New York are, there is a really long-standing traditional craft, and more social practice kind of art scene here that is really unique and wonderful to be around.
Sounds like an incredibly vibrant community to be in.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot of, I mean, I guess if I say what influence I get from artists the most, it's the people I get to interact with. Not just here, but across the country. Artist communities are super inspiring. Just to be able to work alongside people who are really paying attention to their surroundings and aware and creative and just living kind of a quote unquote alternative lifestyle is really inspiring. If working for yourself is alternative.
Right.
Yeah.
When I've been reading about your work, the term climate change has come up quite a bit, and it being kind of something that you think about when you're producing your work. Can you talk about that and what that means to you?
So I've done a series of works that more have to do with ocean related work, one on sea ice patterns in the Arctic, and another looking at glacial retreats. And both of those projects are not made out of wood. They're made out of cast glass and cast ice, respectively, so that the final object that people experience really speaks the nonverbal language, the physicality of the sites and the kind of materials or landscape features that the work is about.
So speaking about landscape features and your process and works that are wood, we've got 3 of your works in the exhibition.
I think they kind of divide into 2 distinct areas. So the 2 more like curvaceous, I mean, I guess they're both, all 3 of them are very curvaceous, but the 2 that are wall hung vertical pieces that are both made out of stacked plywood, and then carved into these really evocative kind of flowing forms, were very much inspired just by how water moves. And were really intended to come up with a workflow to make really sculptural and curvaceous works out of what's generally a very rigid, flat, square material. So I have a process with these forms of starting in clay, and I'll sculpt the initial form at a much smaller scale, just directly with my hands. And I love working with clay because it's the most direct brain hand object material. If anyone's ever worked with wood or glass or other traditional craft materials, many of them have an immense amount of work to just see the final thing through into a shape. And clay is so amorphous that it can really take a shape very immediately. So I like working with clay to create maquettes with some of my work just initially. And in the case of the 2 vertical forms from the Strataform series, of which I've made a good number of a variety of these shapes, they are then first in clay, and then I digitally scan them, and then I'm able to modify, scale, make changes to the details of the form, and then digitally slice them up into layers so that I can more easily cut out the plywood layers and glue them all together to make the final form. So a traditional sculptor would maybe be doing just a reductive process where you start with a block of wood and just remove whatever you don't want, and what's left is the final sculpture. I'm doing a bit more of a reductive and additive process so that I have a lot more control over the shape that I'm making. And because I'm carving layers of plywood, I particularly like the plywood because it has these topographic lines in the ways that the veneers are alternately layered that become revealed as you carve through the form. And these 2 vertical pieces in the Strataform series actually are, I've designed them in a way that the layers are enhancing the form when they're carved through. So they're not just stacked in an XYZ axis, they're actually, the stacks are angled in a really intentional way to make the topographic lines of the plywood more evocative and interesting to look at. So those 2 pieces in particular are very much about refining that workflow and trying to make a material that is very, generally speaking, straight, flat, boring, and rigid into something that speaks a much more curvy, organic language.
The other work you have in the show is based on the meanderings of a river.
Yeah, so that would be a great example of a piece that's much more data driven in that I actually partnered with a scientific organization in Portland, Oregon called the USGS Oregon Water Science Center. And I actually brought them some really beautiful maps, historic maps, of the Mississippi River meander belt, which were created in 1944 by a cartographer named Harold Fisk, primarily from aerial photography. And I think the entire Mississippi River from start to finish is mapped out in these beautiful illustrations that have gotten a lot of attention in the last, I don't know, 10 years. And they're just stunningly beautiful. And so I brought those to the scientists at the Oregon Water Science Center and said, do you have anything like this? And they were like, well, we don't have anything like that, but we have other, information about different rivers. So they provided me with some LiDAR maps of the Malala River. And LiDAR is essentially the same as radar. They use sound to measure distance to create very detailed three-dimensional scans of the landscape, so they can get very accurate maps of different landscape features doing LiDAR. And they had these for the Malala River. So they provided me with about 15 years of data, and they only had scans every 5 years. So every piece is a little bit different when you're working with data, because data comes in a lot of different forms. In this case, there were a lot of gaps between those years. So I had to go through and use my artistic license to interpolate what the shape of the river might be, between like 2005 and 2009, and create individual layers for each year in this case. And then that all gets stacked up to create one continuous flow to basically capture that section of the river as its path changed between those 15 years. And this particular river changed a lot. A lot of it has to do with the geography of the landscape. So if water is flowing through a very small movable material like small pebbles or sand, it's going to do a lot of alluvial movements. Obviously, in bigger mountains where water is flowing through like big hunk of granite, it's not going to move that rock too quickly. So the Malala River is a much lower river, moved a lot. And then there was actually a flood in between the two last years of the data they provided. So there's an arm of the river that develops towards the front of the sculpture, so that you can see like the river's path actually changed quite a bit in that ending section. And in this case, it's also stacked plywood. It's extremely thin, delicate pieces, in which case I hire out a CNC fabricator to help me cut parts. I've spent many, many hours working on bandsaws, and a lot of my pieces have just been cut by hand. But in certain cases, when it calls for it, I absolutely embrace using some new technology. So some of those pieces are cut on a CNC and then stacked up and then just very delicately carved back by hand. So I really love the carving process. It's very cathartic for me, even though it's loud and dusty and gross. And honestly, plywood is not a very fun material to carve because it's really, really hard and dense. I'd much prefer to carve solid wood, actually, and I'm kind of getting away from carving as much plywood. But it does have those beautiful lines, and it's really quite durable, especially when you go very, very thin, because it doesn't have the problem of grain direction and short grain, which could easily break if the river curves a particular way. So that's kind of an example of how you're always contending with what your material can do, and if it can achieve the form that the spirit of the idea, in this case, the flow of a river, is calling for.
So you are not only a working artist, but you're also an art professor. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about balancing those two parts of your lives, and maybe talking about also how technology comes into that, how if you're being part of a university has brought new technologies to your attention, and or how you're using technology with your students.
That's a great question. There's sort of two sides. I would say the new technologies I've been exposed to has not been through schools or universities. That has mainly been through residencies that I've participated in. So a huge part of my art practice is art residencies. It was much bigger previously, and then COVID happened, and then I've kind of just slowed down a little bit on how much I want to travel. But some residencies can give you access to really, you know, high end, like cutting edge technology that you would normally not have access to necessarily in a university, but even just out in the public as an artist. You know, if I hire someone to fabricate or make parts for me, it's never me running the machine or learning the insides of that. I only want to do that a little bit. Anyways, I don't really want to run machines. I'd rather make things with my own hands, but residencies have really filled in the new technology side of things. Teaching has been a really wonderful part of my practice in terms of mentorship. And I do love teaching skills. And primarily, I've taught basically like a woodworking 101 class for furniture design. So taking anyone who may or may not have the ability to use a table saw, and getting them fully up to speed on all machines in the wood shop to make their first piece of furniture, which is interesting because it's much more technical than I normally work, and I don't actually do much functional work, nor do I use much joinery in my woodworking practice. But it's a skill set I've developed and kept very active just by making 10 other, my students work by helping them problem solve how to build those things. So it's extremely rewarding to see someone go from being really scared of using a machine to like really adept at having the agency to make things themselves. And I find that super inspiring. And love doing it. However, academia is tough and it's in a tough place. And the way that I've balanced it is by only teaching one class at a time and by staying an adjunct, which means I don't really have any benefits or guarantee of future work at the universities I work at. But I don't have to go to as many meetings and the bureaucratic side of teaching at a university level that I think can sometimes make people really burned out. Yeah.
Right. What's in your studio right now?
I just finished a piece for a client who has a house in Big Sur and wanted something that was sculptural but related to that landscape. And right near Big Sur, California, is this massive underwater canyon called the Monterey Bay Canyon, and it's the equivalent scale and size and depth to the Grand Canyon, but it's completely submerged underwater. And there's a whole lot of scientific research happening right where it exits and is right off the coast of California near Moss Landing, because there's a ton of really cool like sea life and creatures, I think, that are related to the upwelling and all the water churning from this massive deep underwater canyon. So I ended up using some of the maps from that canyon to create like a sculptural version of a section of the canyon that is like a large carved sculpture. So that's what's in my workshop right now. And then I'm about to start a new public art project that will be a big wood log that's going to be carved into sculptural seating, and it's supposed to install next summer or fall. And for that project, I sourced a salvaged old growth redwood log from Northern California. So back when they were logging all the old growth redwoods, if there was like a creek or a stream that all of the logging equipment needed to get over, they would just chop down a tree, lay it across the gap, and then like cover it with dirt to make a road. And those trees basically was salvaged from what's called an old Humboldt crossing. So that's what the stream crossings were called. So a woodworking supply kind of Sawyer, I know up in Northern California, has sourced one of these reclaimed logs that's over 100 years old, and I'm going to be using that for the sculpture so that it's already seasoned really well, so it's going to be super stable as opposed to a tree that was just cut down yesterday that's going to move and crack and do weird things. And is just a resource that we don't have anymore because we've cut down so many of those old growth trees, and they don't come back very quickly if they're 100 years old. So I'm very lucky to have found this tree, and that's kind of the concept for the piece. And then there'll be a graphic on the ground below it that has to do with some river patterns as well, since it was for a plaza in front of a new university that's being built in downtown Oakland. So yeah, the next year we'll be working on that in addition to some teaching on the side. Yeah.
Well, Adrien, thank you so much for speaking with us today and for participating in the exhibition. Your work really adds some amazing beauty and really deep thoughts about how man has impacted the environment and how the environment and man can impact your work. So thank you so much for participating.
Yeah, thank you. It's been lovely talking to you.